Right, welcome everyone who can attend this last session of the day. I am joined by Emily Lofting-Kisakye, who is HRD of Cognita Schools Group, formerly HRD of the Europe area, I believe, for Urban Outfitters, has vast experience in designing and implementing people strategy, business transformation, driving engagement through times of change, all the big, huge, massive HR topics, things that will be on the agenda for a lot of leading HR practitioners right now. So it is my pleasure to be joined by her for the next 15 to 20 minutes as hey Emily, as I put to her some of the key challenges that perhaps she's been facing during this time and some of the solutions and things that HR should be doing to help solve them. So Emily, what have you been up to over the last few months as we've moved through this difficult period?
Well, it's been a bit of a mix actually, because as we said, I left Urban recently and I've started somewhere new. So it's been a little bit of a mix of a bit of rest, which I feel quite privileged to have had, because most of our HR colleagues, I'm sure, do not feel that rested at the moment. And then lots of furlough conversation, lots of engagement conversation. I think, the pandemic has proven something we all knew, which is the people department is the linchpin of business, in that a people-centered business narrative is going to help you right now and for the future in a very challenging moment. And it's so nice to have seen the positive outcome of the pandemic be that the people narrative is now higher up the agenda, is in a place where you can drive it harder, and is also in a place where you can massively impact and add value to business at the moment. There's not many people I know in HR that don't feel like that at the moment, as well as feeling really tired, because I think there's a lot of things that are hitting us at the moment. And I'm, coming into Cognita on the back end of this pandemic, but that doesn't make it easier, because the back end is almost like we've come out of the process of furlough and office closures and school closures and store closures and everything you never thought would happen. It's almost like we're coming out of those process and tactical driven moments into this very challenging, engaging moment where how do we now engage with teams? How do we, if we're reopening offices, how do you bring people back into those offices? If you open stores and schools, how do you bring team members back feeling safe and engaged? How do you prove you did the best job for your people in the most difficult time? So I think now is actually going to be even more challenging. I think as HR professionals, we need to take a deep breath as we go into this next phase of the pandemic and what it's given us.
So I know engagement prior to the pandemic was almost seen as something that's like a silver bullet in HR, isn't it? Obviously, you've just said that becomes really difficult as we move to this like medium-term stage, I guess, of the pandemic, looking for the long term. What would you suggest, or what should come next in terms of trying to drive better engagement as we transition from the first to the next stage?
Yeah, I think it's really hard, because I think as HR leaders, our duty of care is to the employee population, but also to the executive teams that we work within and help to drive forward. It would be remiss of HR not to remind and encourage around engagement strategies at the moment, remembering that nobody has had this much time before in the same four walls to very carefully watch and listen everything that their business and other businesses are doing in terms of treating people. If you were furloughed, what was your communication like? If you weren't, what was your communication like? Because maybe your desk colleague who you always spoke to suddenly was on furlough and you didn't speak to them a lot. What was the well-being strategy over that time? What was the provision for mental health care over that time? And I think it's hard as execs because we get very busy. We're in lots of meetings, and you need to try and pull back and remember everyone's watching, and the decisions we're making now and how we're treating people now is what will make the difference between labour turnover, if simply put, in 12 to 18 months' time. Because lots of people will be sitting and watching and making decisions as to whether they like how they were treated by that business. So engagement becomes even more multifaceted, because you are also then dealing with remote engagement. Engagement with everyone in one place is one thing. Remote engagement is something wholly different. Being sensitive to everybody's personal situation. So I think engagement strategy right now has to be the linchpin and the centre, if it wasn't before, of the people narrative. To remember that people are the thing that will and have carried us through this pandemic, and the fairness in approach and the transparency is going to be really important. You've seen some of the big businesses come out early on and say, Twitter, work from home forever. Google will pay $1,000 towards your working from home setup. Facebook, work from home if you want. Amazing, we can hire anyone anywhere. We'll just make sure all the salaries are localized. All people that you would expect to come out, but all have come out in front and center, and that's really exciting and lovely to see. But imagine that is what all of your employee base are watching and seeing. So what are you doing, and how are you communicating? How effectively have you moved to remote communication? And if you are starting to come back into an office, remote conflict resolution, I think, is quite challenging. If people don't really want to come back in, but their teams need to, what happens? How do you deal with that? How's the fairness of, I don't know, a lot of offices will operate at 25% occupancy. So what's the fairness of a booking system? Who comes in, who doesn't, who still dials in? Not to forget that anyone with children, unless you're the 3 years that have gone back, have children at home, don't have childcare. Normal childcare arrangements will not be happening right now. So how do we also make sure those people feel cared for and understood during this period of time? It's very complicated.
Is one of the next steps going to be then ensuring that the individual is always at the centre of this experience of work or this engagement strategy? And I say this with half a mind to, perhaps with some of the things you've been talking about, some people might not be able to come into the office because of childcare. Some might have anxieties about health, and this could create almost like a two-tier system of employees where some can't come back in, and those that maybe feel like they have to return for whatever kind of culture exists there harbour resentment or ill feeling towards those that aren't coming back. And
I also think in some industries you get that silo naturally, because you have some teams that can naturally work from home and you have some teams that naturally cannot. So you're already dealing with that silo. That for me is where authentic leadership and transparency are absolutely critical, because you don't have to make every decision an individual decision, but you can have clear, transparent communication from executive leadership that allow an environment for those individuals to come forward and talk about how they're feeling. Now, you could take it to the extreme to say, if you have been doing an amazing job with your communications, you will already have identified who are in those groups of people. So when you're communicating, your communications can be different to different groups. But look, that's a little bit idealistic, because HR teams, are normally notoriously slightly lean, and they've been incredibly stretched over this period. So they may not be able to, but now, hopefully at the end of furlough, and we're seeing, the economy hopefully reignite, that is where we can start to focus in terms of, engagement, communications, and to your point, how individual can we make it? But the key thing, as I said, will be the authentic leadership that creates the environment for the question, rather than, well, the culture dictates I have to, whether I want to or not. And that's key. And actually, in the remote way of working, there's lots of amazing ways that you can communicate. You know, if previously you had all company meetings, you can still hold webinars with leaders where anonymous questions can come through. In fact, Cognita did something like that last week, which was incredibly successful. Just being able to get that hand-to-hand feel of like that, the executive's right there, he's on the screen, she's on the screen, I can see them, I feel like I can connect, I can ask a question, you know, there'll be follow-up. That feels good. But we have to be dynamic in how we use the remote way of working, because I don't think it's going to go away overnight, but I think it's going to be with us for some time, if not forever, in some industries and businesses. So how do we make the best of it and adapt accordingly in terms of communication and engagement?
So I'd like to pick up on the remote working thing. I think because of the forced necessity of many firms going remote almost overnight, is there anything from this period of time, and it might be regard the comms piece, it might be regard properly assessing their culture and who is able to do what, that all organizations should look to take forward, whether that might be the flexibility, the adaptability?
Yeah. I mean, we definitely all saw, you know, social media posts of, oh, the companies that turned down the flexible working arrangement because working from home never was an option. Guess what? Everyone's now working from home and nothing's fallen apart. I think if you're smart, you take this moment to review and go back to basics on what is a flexible working policy? What does it actually mean? Do you need to go back to the time where everyone needs to submit that? Have we just proven it can be a bit more of an adult environment? But actually, I think the key thing with remote working is really understanding your percentage split of how people feel. So I think the national split is something like 30% really want to get back to an office for structure, socialization, etc. 30% really would love to stay from home. I think 10 to 20% are not wanting to come in because they're shielding, or they live with someone that's shielding. They don't want to use public transport. And then the last percentage is we're unsure. And that's fine for a national stat, but I think we should at the minute be trying to communicate quickly to each business to understand what's your percentage split. So when you're communicating, do you know how your employees actually feel? So in a schools or store environment, that's quite hard to do, because to do your job, you have to be there. Potentially in some management leadership roles, you could have more flexibility, but if you are a teacher, or you know, you are a department manager of an area, you need to be there. The more senior leaders, potentially more flex. But if you're in a head office environment, the question now will be, why do I need to be there if I don't want to be? So I think the first part in that is to try and establish what percentage of your people do not want to come back into an office, if you have a culture where you want them back, or if you flip that, if you want to maintain remote working, how many of your employees do not want to or do want to, so you know where you're going in that engagement conversation, because you don't want to make assumptions or shoot in the dark at this point, because I don't think that's going to yield the engagement results you're looking for.
So I guess to take that thinking one step further, I think what you've just described, some companies might have done for the very first time during this pandemic, or might be doing right now, which is to ask employees not just how they feel about different parts of work, but the overall structure of work. Is that something that should be guiding not just the HR function, I guess, but the business exec going forward?
Well, yeah, I mean, one would hope that in a lot of business it's already happened, where we've all been in offices where we've said, oh, we're going to, every hour's meeting is going to turn into a 45-minute meeting because we want that 15-minute buffer between meetings. And either it happens and you fill the 15-minute with another meeting, or it doesn't happen. So, you know, one side of this is, in some businesses, they would have effectively looked at meeting scheduling, because now everyone is on video. You don't have many if you leave the meeting or the meeting carries on and you chit chat afterwards, you don't, do you? Because everyone's on video, they've stopped the video, they've turned it down, they're on to the next thing. However, I do fear that in some places there's been an increase in meetings, as it's, well, we're not together, I don't see you, so we should have more moments where we can see each other. And I think that's something to be aware of. The other thing is this, we're on video all the time. So if you were in back-to-back meetings in an office all day, you wouldn't be looking at yourself for 8 hours. You'd be looking at another person. Whereas in this situation, looking at yourself and another person, people on calls. So I think something I've been doing recently is trying to focus on walking meetings is great. I learned that from a peer of mine in industry. Try and do a good 2 or 3 days a day, get some steps in, get some fresh air. Not everything has to be on video. Just because we're not together doesn't mean everything has to be on video. But yeah, meeting, scheduling, and efficiency should be a big part of this. And actually is going to have to be, because 100% occupancy in an office is a long way off. So you're not going to be there yet. And you don't want to, if it is a 25% occupancy rate, which it will be for a lot, you don't want to fill that with the wrong people because your meeting scheduling wasn't quite right. So, in the best case, you've already looked at that. In the worst case, you're starting to look at it now, realizing that we're not going to be full in offices this year, at least, if not next year.
So having touched on, well, that is like the very practical steps of how to be more efficient at work, engagement and culture. Unfortunately, we are running out of time for today. So I guess what a lot of our attendees would be really interested in is, how can HR now add the most value to its business, but also to shine the function in the best light going forward? What would your, I guess, like a couple of top tips on that be?
Yeah, one would be, please lead from the front. This moment has forced many of us to be tactical. Pivot now, lead from the front, get into the executive meetings, make sure that your team and you have a voice. And it's hard when you've been forced into being tactical for a sustained period of time. That will be crucial. And really going back to what I said about please try and understand your business. So understand, when you're trying to engage with people remotely, understand how your population breaks down in terms of interest of working from home or not, or if you would potentially have themes and patterns in any remote conflict resolution, because that's going to help you build an engagement plan a lot more effectively. Getting time now with execs to talk about engagement could be challenging. So try and socialize it, plant the seed, be front of foot, so that when that moment comes, you already have got a lot of groundwork and facts to base from in terms of where you're going now. Because, we know HR have done an incredible job during this process, often with limited resources and budgets. Now is a time to try and use that in an opportunistic way for the future, for the next 18, 24 months, to build your area to be something that is seen as a leader in business, that has that really definite seat in the table and commands that people narrative.